When it comes to the Bible as it exists, like most of you might have in your hands right now or in your iPhone, because some of you are using your YouVersion. When it comes to the Bible, you know how you got your version of the Bible, but probably what you don't know enough about, is you don't know how we got the Bible. And for most of us, we kind of think that maybe the Bible just has always existed, and that's not true. Now, when I say that, I want to make sure that you hear me not say something. I'm not saying that there was never a time when the sacred texts weren't important. I'm not saying that the Old Testament is not valuable, but it's just this idea that at one point in time, the Bible, as you're holding it, as it exists today, did not exist. It was not a part of our modern culture. The disciples did not get to walk around carrying a book, referencing it all the time, and mostly because they wrote it. And so for most of them, they were living it as it came out. By the time you got your Bible, you got a version that had chapters and verses, and some of you even got the really cool tabs, so you don't have to memorize the order, right? You can just look down the side and not feel awkward at times, and that's okay too. But that's not how it originally appeared, right? And when the authors that started writing this book, when they started writing, they were not trying to write a Bible. They were not trying to write the next sacred text. They were simply doing what they thought was important. They were writing something they had become very convinced about. So you have to remember, when Jesus was crucified and buried, that his disciples scattered. They were nervous. They were worried about being persecuted. They were worried about dying themselves. And that's the group of people that existed that began to write. And why did they write? Because something happened that changed all of their minds. Something happened that was important that launched all of these little books that came together that we now call the Bible. And it was simply this, that this man they had followed, this man they had given all their devotion to, this man they claimed was the Messiah, that even though he died, he got up and he walked out of the grave. And that flipped everything. So then you can read Luke when he wrote this in Luke chapter 1. At the very beginning, he writes this: "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have just been accomplished among us." In other words, all of these things that have just happened, Luke says a bunch of people are trying to write it all down. A bunch of people are trying to record it for a certain reason. Verse 2, "Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good also to me." It seemed really good to me that, having followed all these things closely from the time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. We talked about him last week, just apparently some wealthy Roman guy who is important enough that Luke needed to report to. He says, "that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." That we learn in this little first intro to Luke's gospel that there was a reason he started writing. And he wasn't writing because he thought, I'm about to write the next Bible, I'm about to write a bestseller, I'm about to write the next sacred text. He started writing because something happened worth documenting. So the reason you have something in your hands this morning, the reason you have a Bible, is because something happened worth documenting, and these people started writing it down. More than the miracles, more than the teachings, more than all these things that Jesus was doing at the time, that was a part of it, right? They wrote about it, but they didn't start writing until after he walked out of the grave, because then they were certain. Then there was some assurance. Then all of a sudden their confidence went through the roof, right? When Jesus was resurrected, they realized something has happened that's worth writing down. We're convinced, and they began to record these things. John made a very similar statement towards the end of his gospel. He said this in John 20, verse 30. He said, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book." Like, we didn't write them all down. Don't come expecting to find everything in here. But look what he says. "But these things are written, that you, us, them." He was writing to a certain people, but it's lasted, it's lived on. "But you," so anybody who reads this account, John, "that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." You have a Bible in your hands this morning because something happened that was worth documenting. Something happened that was worth writing down. And these original firsthand accounts were put out into the world. These men began to write it down, and they've been documented, they've been tested, and believe it or not, they will withstand every literary test you can throw at them. They're more documented than most of the books we have from the ancient Near East. So we now have this understanding that this didn't always exist, but it came about because something happened worth documenting. If you're like me, can I tell you, just be brutally honest? If you're like me, I question so much. I almost question everything. My wife gets tired of this. I can read a post online, and we're at the point today where I don't know if it's true or not, right? Like you can read even from news stories. I don't care. You pick one of the biggest news media outlets, and I read their story, and I don't necessarily believe it anymore. Where it's such an age where it seems like we doubt things because of the way they're being written or they're always being slanted a certain direction. These guys started writing in a culture that you wrote the important things down. You didn't go to the local grocery store and get a new notebook to write stuff down. There was no easy access to writing utensils. Most people didn't read or write. So there was already this filter to help us understand that for this writing to have lasted means it was very important, right? It withstood the test of time. It became trusted. It became reliable. Eventually it became sacred and eventually was canonized into this thing we call the Bible. But that was 250 years after Christ. So this thing did not always exist as it exists in your hands today. Now that we know that, let's talk a little bit more this week about the distinctions. If this that the apostles started writing, this second half, right? This is the part that they were around to write. If this was so important, if it got tested, if it got tried, if they were writing down what they saw, what they experienced, what they were convicted of, how did it get put like this? How did these two pieces get put together? And we're going to start today, and we're going to get more into the Old Testament next week. But let me jump in and see if I can't walk you a little way down this path and hopefully bring some clarity to why this thing gets bound together like it does. Number one, in the beginning, when Paul started to share the gospel outside of the Jewish nation, when the gospel started to spread out and people started hearing about Jesus for the first time, what happened? They got enamored. They started to get inquisitive and excited, and as people began to follow Jesus, they started asking more questions. Why? Because you do the same thing. Like, where did this Jesus come from? And as they started to ask those questions, what they did is they began to dig into these other books that had existed, these sacred texts, this thing that Moses wrote, the first 5 books called the Torah, the law. They started to ask questions because the Old Testament was a prequel to Jesus. The Old Testament points to him. So you can imagine that as people started coming to faith, they started to ask the question, well, what is this about? How did Christ even get here? How did we miss this? How did we not pay attention that there was going to be a Messiah? And so as Paul and the apostles began to spread the gospel around the world, a natural inquisitiveness would come about. And so people would start going and studying these Old Testament passages. Now, as they did that, one thing would rock the ancient Near Eastern world. One thing would come out that would shock them and actually create a lot of persecution for Christians, and it was simply this: that distinction number one is there is only one God. It's not uncommon in their world to have talked about gods. It's not uncommon to have talked about spirituality. It was not uncommon to even admit that you were spiritual, or to go to places of worship, or to temples, or to make sacrifices. That was not uncommon in their world. What was uncommon was what Moses said in Genesis 1:1 as this whole thing started out. Look with me. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Not gods, God. Now, we read that, you've heard that, maybe you've heard that verse a lot in your life. Maybe you've never even been to church, but you just have heard it. And the thing is what you don't pay attention to is how uncommon that was in their culture. That they were used to talking about gods. They were at ease talking about gods. The whole world believed about gods. What they didn't understand was a God. Moses wrote this, and listen, I say this all the time, so if you're new here, get used to this statement. Moses didn't write Genesis to tell us how creation happened. He didn't write to tell us the how of creation. He didn't write this to begin talking about DNA, cell biology, right? He didn't write to talk about what's necessary for the atmosphere to be just the right for life to actually happen. That's not what Genesis is about. He didn't write this so that we could know all the hows. Moses wrote Genesis so that we could know the who of creation. He wrote so that we could know that it wasn't God's, it was a God. It was one God was the source of all life. One God, Yahweh, the creator of all things, the universe, not multiple gods. Rome didn't believe this. The pagan world at that time didn't believe this. This was shocking. This was shocking. And the thing is, in their culture, they would have had things like this. They would have had a household god. They would have had gods over their little cities or areas or towns. They would have had gods over the empire. They would have had gods all throughout their culture. And I know you studied this probably back in high school, and maybe you didn't think about it at the time, but polytheistic cultures where there are multiple gods, the gods bleed into everything they do. So you didn't convert back in Paul's day, and I'm going to say something, and I'm picking on anybody, but I'll just say it. A Mormon would not go to the door of a local Jewish person and knock and try to convert them to Mormonism. That's not how religion worked for them. If you moved into an area and your neighbors worshiped a new god you'd never heard of, they would tell you about the god, and you would add that god to your gods. Maybe to the gods that your great-grandparents had always worshipped, or that they brought with them when they moved from another country or another area. Everything was about adding to the gods, not one God. This was revolutionary. This created all kinds of persecutions. As Christians would come to faith, as people would start to follow Jesus, they were denying the very fabric of their culture. See if you can relate to this. Anybody heard the term Bible Belt, right? Anybody, do you believe we live in the Bible Belt? Raise your hands, let me see. A couple of you do. Okay, you might be surprised to know that I looked up some things, and in 2011, I don't know who they is, Pew Research, okay, but there was a ranking of the top 10 states that they would consider Bible Belt. Now, Bible Belt means these are really religious areas. They tend to hold to Christianity. The faith even bleeds into politics. And in fact, sometimes this is what is not good. Our politics, our policy becomes our faith. And that's a lot of times what you will find in Bible Belt areas, right? In 2011, Texas didn't even make the top 10 states. So if you think it's Bible friendly or God friendly here, maybe we're just friendly because it's Texas. This is not a Bible Belt area, and I always kick against that when people disagree with me. But here's the thing, and I don't know if you knew this or not. First century Christians, as they would push against polytheism, and they would say, no, we don't have a house God. We don't have an area. We don't have a neighborhood God. And by the way, we're not going to worship you, Caesar, as God. Do you know what they would call them? They were atheists. In their culture, they were atheists, not because atheism meant that it was about belief or unbelief, but because in their culture, everything was about participating and incorporating the gods. So to say that you believed in one God and to push all the other gods away was to them an anomaly. You were not a believer. You were an atheist. You just didn't believe in the gods. It was something that marked early Christians. And so they were persecuted because polytheism was a part of the whole culture in their day. If you got together, maybe you were a baker in your community, you got together with other bakers to talk business, you had a god over bakery. If you got together and you were a farmer, you had a god who was over the crops. If you were a fisherman, you got together and you had a god who was over fishing. And everybody recognized everybody else's God. And you'd get together for dinners and you would pay tribute to those gods. So can you imagine when Christians started pushing back and all of a sudden saying, no, there's one God? They became atheists in their culture. Christians didn't recognize shrines and temples anymore. They didn't create little idols and set up little places in their home. It wasn't that way. And that was completely opposite of their whole culture. Do you understand? That means they were pushing away from the culture they were living in. And they did it. Listen, I know we talk about the Bible Belt, and I know there's some weird implications for all of that, but these guys were doing this because it wasn't about folding into the culture to be like them when their belief systems were counter to what they were learning from God. So household guardians, household gods, regional gods all went away as people came to faith. Christians became known as atheists. And listen, there was this radical new belief system that was evolving because of their theology. And I know that we don't like that word sometimes. It feels like, oh, theology, that's man-made things. No, theology is just simply the study of God. And as these Christians would walk with God, learn more about him, what would happen is they would begin to push back on areas where the local culture didn't match what they understood about God. So they would no longer participate in the local temples. They would no longer call Caesar God. They would no longer bow a knee to him. And all of a sudden, they were the evil people in their culture. Distinction number one, there is only one God. There is only one God. That's what you start to see as the new writings start to get laid in with the old writings and the prequel of who we're looking for, this Messiah that's going to come that's being told in the Old Testament. The very first distinctive is we are looking for one God. There is only one creator of the universe. Distinction two, Moses wrote the first 5 books. If you didn't know that, he wrote those first 5 books of what you call the Old Testament, of what we now bind up and call the Bible. The idea of one God was completely Jewish. So right now you should probably ask the question, well, if that was completely Jewish, then why weren't the Romans persecuting the Jews? Well, there was one good reason. The Romans were superstitious, and they honored things of old. And what they knew is that the Jews, with their one God, was older than anything they had ever come up with. That faith, that belief system was ancient, and the Roman people loved ancient things. So they left the Jewish followers of God alone. They didn't leave the Christians alone because the Christians were considered new, and they were being more vocal about it. The Jews had learned to live in culture. About 19th or 20th century, though, some things would happen in our world that began to cast a lot of doubt on these writings that Moses put together. We started discovering a lot of text from the ancient Near East, a lot of creation stories, the Babylonians, the Canaanite, the Sumerians, the Egyptians. All of these creation stories started coming out in the 19th and 20th centuries through scholarship, through excavation, through archaeological studies. And what we would find is this what seemed to be an indictment on the Bible, that perhaps Moses didn't really write this himself, like this was not original. Perhaps Moses, and you heard this in school, I bet, that Moses borrowed his creation story from somebody else, that the Sumerians had been around longer, the Babylonians had been around longer. In fact, it's recorded that the Enuma Elish, their creation story, is from about 2000 BC, when we know the first 5 books came about around 1400 BC. So why the discrepancy, right? One culture is borrowing from another. That's what we would say today. And so obviously Moses didn't write this. Now I can tell you today, and you can go read books. You can ask me if you want to read more on this. I'm highlighting some things for you because probably none of you want to read all of this stuff like I do. My wife tells me all the time, nobody reads this stuff. I understand. I keep book people in business. Here's the thing. When a culture borrows from another culture, what traditionally we see happen is they take the story and they elaborate on it a little bit more. Now, my wife will tell you, okay, this is not totally true, but my wife will tell you that when I tell a story, I don't give you all the details. In fact, that I leave some things out that she thinks are really important. I tell my wife all the time, you tell the details, I'll tell the entertaining story, right? Like I know how to make it entertaining. That's what I want to do. I want to make it entertaining. When we look at history, that's what you traditionally see. If a culture is going to borrow something from one culture, they're traditionally going to borrow that and they're going to amp it up. Like they're going to add some things to it. They're going to embellish it. They're going to make it a little bigger than life. This was the accusation that Moses went back to the Babylonian creation story and he borrowed from them. And I'm going to tell you something. It's pretty much widely accepted now that that's not true. And it was really interesting. One of the experts on the ancient Near East and also a biblical scholar from 1966, this book he wrote, I'll tell you his name. His name is Kenneth Kitchen, and you can actually still find him. He's 86 years old, still kicking, and still considered to be an expert. I love this comment because here's what he said. As we started to realize that that's not really what happened, as we started to understand the biblical text more and find more fragments and find the veracity of it, to find out that it had not changed. Here's what he wrote. He said, the common assumption that the Hebrew account is simply a purged and simplified version of a Babylonian legend is fallacious on methodological grounds. Now, say that a lot of times fast. In the ancient Near East, the rule is that simple accounts or traditions may give rise to elaborate legends, but not vice versa. In other words, he said, just look at the story, look at the evidence, look at what we have. This Babylonian story is elaborated on. It's been glamorized a little bit. You say, well, but that still doesn't help me. How did they write it in 2000 BC if Moses wrote his in 1400? Because with the Hebrew people, everything was oral tradition up until then. Everything was oral tradition. And so now I can tell you that even though the oral preceded the written, that we pretty much accept now that Moses' account is the original creation account. And I know somebody's not going to believe that. Maybe you don't. If you want to do more study, that's great. I'm just telling you that this thing, the way it plays out, maybe the way you were taught this in school, some of the things you were told in college and all, that it's not as clean as everybody wants you to believe it is, right? That what happened was that God began to work on our part. And in the beginning, God created. God created. And from all of these religions are not the same, right? But now we start to get more clarification. So in 1927, here's what happens. I'm going to take this step just a step further. 1927, a Belgian priest shows up on the scene. We had just believed that time had always been, right? In the beginning, God created. Moses wrote it down. Time has always been. Ever since the time of Aristotle, time has just kind of existed. In 1927, a Belgian priest shows up with, and I think I've got his picture. Do we have a picture of him? You're going to love this guy. I won't butcher his name for you, but there he is. He shows up on the scene, and he basically asserts this. He has discovered that the universe began at one single point. In the beginning, God created. He said the universe began in one moment. Now, Aristotle, everybody had said, no, that's not how it is. Life has just always been around. Until 1964, when a couple of radio astronomers were playing around and made this discovery that, I'll read you the name, the cosmic microwave background, that what happened was they discovered that the universe is actually moving out. And as the universe expands, it affirms what this priest, this Belgian priest, had said, that the universe began in one moment. In the beginning, God created. First distinction, there's one God. Second distinction, the universe had a beginning. We didn't believe this until recently. 1964, 1967, when we began to understand what was happening in the world and the scientific community caught up to what Moses wrote. In the beginning, God created. It's not how he did it, it's who did it, but it affirms that, listen, in 1 trillion of a trillionth of a second, the universe began. That it was in one moment on the scene. Prior to that moment, it wasn't here. Moses is not trying to explain to us how it happened. The story is valid. He has the original creation story. He is simply asserting there is a God and the universe had a beginning. It did not always exist. Now, that may seem like it's not that important to you, but what we get is we're beginning to get the foundation of who God is. We're beginning to build on this idea of what he has done, because I want to go over one more quick distinction. And this is kind of the pinnacle to me. Like, we're building on this thing. Like, there's a God, and now he spoke something into existence. Now let's find out why. When you see in the beginning God created, what we learn is God created, not Egypt's gods, not the Babylonian god. Have you ever heard of Marduk? The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian story of creation. Marduk is their god who rides into battle on the back of two steeds. I guess he's standing up because that's what you do if you're a god. You can stand up on those horses, ride into battle, and he fires an arrow at this goddess, Tiamat. I forget her name all the time. And he kills her, wounds her in the neck, kills her. He takes his sword and he cuts her in half. In the top half, he creates the heavens. The bottom half of her body, he makes the earth. And all of a sudden, you have the greatest Sunday school lesson ever. I don't know what you would do if your kids come home talking about that. They didn't get it. I told them not to teach that. Marduk says this. Now, pay attention. I will establish a savage man. Man shall be his name. Savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. You see why the Caesars wanted to be gods? The whole teaching was that if you could be a god, you were going to be catered to, that everything should be at ease. You should have everything you want. In the beginning, God created. One God speaks something into existence, and now we have to ask the question, why? What's going on? And this, again, will be unparalleled in the ancient Near East. This is stuff they didn't realize. This is stuff they'd never heard. Genesis 1, jump to 26, verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Unlike the pagan world, mankind is not an afterthought with God. In the pagan world, in the Enuma Elish, mankind is an afterthought. And the gods are angry. And they're throwing him out there to kind of play with him, toy with him, to amuse themselves, to entertain themselves, to meet their needs. Yahweh creates mankind to reflect his image, to walk in relationship. Distinction number 3, mankind was made in God's image. We were made in God's image. So when he says, I've created you, that you can have dominion over that you can rule over the birds of the air, over the land, over the animals. Listen, it's not to worship them, right? It's not to make idols out of them. It's not to deify animals. It's so that we can oversee them. We can rule over them. We can steward them. Listen, we're still struggling with that today. If you don't believe that climate change is a thing, it doesn't matter. Listen to me. I want you to hear me on this. I don't care what you believe when it comes to climate change. If you follow God, you're already a steward of the planet. We're missing it. We're still struggling with how to figure this out. And we're fighting over things. Why are we fighting? Because we're fighting about God more than we are fighting about what he's asked us to do. We've been asked to steward the planet. One God spoke everything into existence, a beginning, so we could be created in his image and walk in relationship. And now our job is to steward. That is the beginning. When the disciples began to write the new stuff, the second half that you would call the New Testament, when they started writing this, and everybody started going back, going, well, wait a minute, what about this old stuff? What about these Hebrew writings? Why is that it's so important? These are the things they were being trained in. These are the things they were learning, and these are the things that were setting them up to serve God more. That there is one God, not like the rest of the world. There is one God who created everything of his own accord. He did it. God didn't create things and like we can learn about him through creation, but he has not created himself. He existed before all of this, which is why he deserves to be worshiped. One God who spoke things into existence. There was a beginning. Why? So that we can, as images, as being created in his image, we can walk with him in relationship and steward the world. The Babylonian story, you're created to be a slave to the gods. The new atheism today, you're a slave to your DNA. This story, you're created in the image of a holy God to walk in relationship. You have freedom. You have choices. He allows it. He even allows the consequences of our choices, but he loves us enough to offer something one step further. We're going to get more into this, but he offers that one step more of relationship through his son. So you've got the beginning, and we talked about the end, and next week we're going to get more into the Old Testament, some of those promises that are made there. But know this, there is one God. Everything was spoken into existence by him. Why? So that you can, as a person created in the image of God, walk and live with him and steward the things around him, around us, for the sake of others. Let me pray for us.